Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in a weird place. Master Duel is struggling to reach 20,000 concurrent players, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Reigns ended in 2019, which means it's been 7 years since the last real Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. Whatever this was does not count. Starting with the release of Duel Monsters in the year 2000, Yu-Gi-Oh! Essentially ran from 2000 to 2019 across 6 different series, with 2013 being the only barren year between Zexal ending in 2012 and Arc 5 starting in 2014. That is nearly 19 years of consistent Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. To go 7 without anything is uncharted land for the series. But honestly, the anime isn't our main focus of today. It does, however, play a large role into what I'm talking about.
Exodia! Obliterate!
Yu-Gi-Oh! Has lost its magic. I don't mean spell cards like the Pot of Greed,
I play the magic card, Pot of Greed,
or even the Dark Magician himself. I mean the very game. The game that drew us in and had us hooked in the first place. I mean, today's Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so different from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Of 10 years ago, let alone 20, but the joy of the game has always been in its interactability.
Well, now it's my turn!
Even today's game is defined by how you interact with your opponent, but the way in which you do so has changed so drastically that I want to take you with me and explore where those changes occurred and how the change in interaction has sucked the soul of Yu-Gi-Oh's most unique factor. Firstly, I want to explain the interactability of Yu-Gi-Oh! At its most basic level, say you have a face-down card in your back row, and I choose to summon a monster and attack with it. You reveal your face-down card to be Mirror Force, which destroys my attacking monster, and then from there, I could look to set my own cards face down to affect your next turn. Picture a game of chess, but when you recklessly step on e4, your spleen explodes. Now, you might have had a counter spell or trap that protects your monster or negates their trap card, but it's this very back and forth that's constantly present throughout every turn in Yu-Gi-Oh! What that does to the mind games and the duel itself, that is what I mean when I say interactability. In contrast, let's look at the Pokemon TCG. Yes, I mean the actual gameplay. Now, you may have your main Pokemon. Perhaps you might even set up a bench of some sorts. And then your normal turn would be maybe evolving one of your Pokemon, placing an energy. I don't know how you do this anymore. We'll do that. And then maybe even using a trainer card. You would then use, say I had more, one of those attacks on the opponent's Pokemon, it would do that damage, and then turn would pass. The only moment you actually interact with your opponent is in that attacking phase. The rest of the turn, you're on your own. I want to point out that there's nothing wrong with this at all, but the more interaction points you can have in a game, the more active it feels. This is where I always thought that Yu-Gi-Oh! Had one up over Pokemon or even a game like Cardfight Vanguard. You know, it felt like you were much more involved in what was happening during each turn. What I'm talking about here is even more obvious to see in the anime. And so many of the iconic moments you think of when you think of Yu-Gi-Oh! Come from the characters countering each other throughout a duel.
You've activated my trap card!
This interactability of the game is also why Yu-Gi-Oh! Had more success in its anime than other TCG shows like Future Card Buddy Fight or Redakai, though I concede that the mechanics of those games have been slightly lost to time on me. So if we're to consider interactability the magic of Yu-Gi-Oh!, then we have to look at how it has changed the game over the course of its existence. Now that we've established how the game was in the early days, I want to look at each respective anime series after that and how it has affected the interactability of the game. I should at this point preface that I've never been a tournament player or even a local player, So my experiences are coming from a much more casual place, playing with friends and brothers, and playing a lot of the video games like on the DS or the PSP. Since GX was more of a direct sequel, we'll mostly skip over it. All you need to know is that it was in a great place. It was a high number of interactions, a good set of spell and trap cards you were playing and thinking around, and the real sort of introduction to archetypes massively helped. It helped the duels feel fresh and give the players a clearer identity in the game. Five Ds was a big change. The Fusion deck became the Extra deck, as to allow for Yu-Gi-Oh's first new mechanic, Synchro Monsters. I remember at the time a lot of people dropping off the game since they thought it complicated the game too much and made it too quick. However, the interactability of the game hadn't actually changed that much at a core level. Synchro Monsters needed these tuner cards, a new type of monster that existed almost as the mechanic's polymerization. I say this because Synchro Monsters acted much like Fusion Monsters at the time. Many of them were tied to archetypes and operated as a boss monster. Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal was up next and made it tradition to introduce a new mechanic with each new series. This said mechanic being XZs. XZ's monsters worked similarly to Synchro and Fusion, but made one massive change: the ease of summoning them. No longer did you need two specific monsters or a specific type of monster to facilitate the summon. Now you just needed two monsters with the same level. I think this change is often overlooked, but it is massive. Now you could bring out your ace monster with a turn 1 Goblin Bird. While Synchro definitely made this speed possible, XZs made it the standard. And this would have huge effects on the interactability of the game going forward.
Alright, the overlay network has been built! Now IXC summon! Number 39, Utopia!
Now XZs didn't totally break the game, unless you also thought the anime rule about number cards not being destroyed by battle was real. But it did set a dangerous precedent that would soon change the game forever. Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 had separate arcs focused on each of the previous series and their main summoning mechanic, but of course they still had to introduce a brand new one: Pendulum Summoning. Pendulum Summoning allowed for widespread monster summons per turn, with Pendulum cards having two effects and way too much text in my opinion. I should say Pendulums are what I have the least experience with, as it is actually where I stopped playing Yu-Gi-Oh! For a long time. This is where I thought the game became too much. I mean, you could do so much in one turn that I would be bored by the time I got back to mine. There was just so many effects and different cards on the field that it became hard to follow and much more complicated and less fun. I'm all for duels getting complicated. They should. But it should be built up over a course of turns, giving players the chance to understand the field of play, what traps to set up. You know, when both players are going back and forth trying to counter each other, that is where Yu-Gi-Oh! Is at its most fun. For me, Pendulums ruined that. Once a player could play half the duel by themselves, I lost interest. But Pendulums were soon to become obsolete. Konami clearly realized that it broke up the flow of the game, so they done the only thing they know how: power creep it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains. The last true Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime series aimed to slow the game down and lock away the other mechanics with its own: Link Summoning. It took whatever barrier was left to extra deck summoning and smashed it. When you could link any monster together and create your boss monster. There was no need for archetypes or even really any variety. To add to this, they had tried to make it so if you wanted to extra summon at all, it had to go through link summoning. Or you could only have one extra deck summon at a time. And whilst I understand the intention to slow down the game, it actually had the opposite effect. Linked monsters became mandatory. The summoning mechanic with the easiest requirements and quickest way to extend your turn through different links and combos. This meant that everyone was having to use links, and each player's turns got longer, whilst the duel itself got shorter. The biggest issue this caused was the lack of diversity. If you had to use links, and there were clearly stronger ones, it meant that everyone was using the same rotation of decks. The variety of archetypes that made Yu-Gi-Oh! So interesting in the GX and 5Ds era was now gone. Sure, meta decks have always existed, but linked monsters made meta decks the necessary evil to play the cards you wanted to. Less variety in the plays and the duels made it a less fun experience as the interactions became fewer and more routine. Konami then changed their mind and made it so that link summoning would just operate as a normal extra deck mechanic like XYZ or Synchro. This solved the initial variety problem with players being able to play their favourite decks that were locked behind Synchro or Fusions, but it worsened another. Speed. Yu-Gi-Oh!, which was once a game about patience, laying traps and thinking 4 steps ahead, taking duels into the 20-30 turn mark, has become a game of can I win in my first turn? One card combos have essentially become mandatory for most archetypes, and if you draw into them, you can summon about 15 monsters in the one turn. What this means for the interactivity of the game is that rather than going back and forth, the player's going first job is to set up a board that entirely stops the other player from playing the game, and then win on the third turn. Interactions used to be unique to each duel and situation. Cards like Magic Cylinder would reflect an attack, or a card like Skull Dice would lower an attack based on how high you can roll your dice. Nowadays, every interaction is based around the principle of stopping your opponent from playing. The magic is gone because every duel feels the same. It's become less of a how can I play around my opponent, and more how can I stop my opponent from playing. That is the biggest shift in interactivity. It's less of a chess match and more of a Argentina versus Spain in the World Cup final. The only real workaround to it has been hand traps, cards that can take effect from your hand. But that's then an issue with the variety of the game. If hand traps have become mandatory to stop the player from shutting you down, then you say might have 23 monsters, but if 10 of them are the same hand traps that everyone else is playing, that's not great variety. Now look, I'm not saying that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't fun. I still enjoy it. But I can't help but feel like the core of what made Yu-Gi-Oh! Special has been lost along the way. Why I still revisit games like the Tag Force games on the PSP or the 5Ds trilogy on the DS. They captured a time when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was about 2 players engaged in a duel, not just one player playing the game whilst the other watches Instagram Reels. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels less like a battle of wits, and more like a flex of your muscles. And that loss to interactivity is where I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Has lost its magic. I don't, however, want to end this video on such a negative note. Yu-Gi-Oh! Are trying new things. They've just released full art cards for the first time in their history, and it's making me want to go pick up some packs. Konami are experimenting with new formats such as Genesis and releasing great products like the 5Ds Legendary decks. 3 pre-packaged decks full of meta staples that you could rock up to a local with. Having released another legendary deck after, and with an Arc 5-1 on its way, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was in a really good place right now. It might not be the game that we fell in love with 20 years ago, but it is growing more positively than it has for the last decade. If you've been out of the game for a while or been hesitant to start, the quality of product and attention Konami is giving the game, now is as good a time as any to find what magic the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to offer. Hi there, if you made it to this part in the video, thank you so much for sticking around and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, do think about leaving a like or even a comment and tell me what you enjoyed and I'll take that going forward. But let me know as well what you think about the modern state of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is it still something you're interested in, or has it gone too far and you can't get back into it? Anyway, have a lovely day and thanks again for watching.